Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Farah, and to Ayana and the executive board and all of the fabulous people, those we see, those we don't see, those we overlook, unintentionally, of course, for making this great effort possible. I am honored and humbled to be before you today to talk a few things about James Weldon Johnson and John Milton. Who would think John Milton, by way of Paradise Lost, would make an intertextual presence in an anti-lynching poem by James Weldon Johnson? How and why does Milton function there? That Milton can be seen operating as a poetics of intertextuality in Johnson's Brothers, American Drama, attests to an ongoing tradition where African-American writers test and testify with the 17th century poet well beyond the close of the 19th century. In preaching the gospel of Black revolt, appropriating Milton in early African-American literature, I chronicle and analyze this tradition as produced by major writers, the likes of Phyllis Wheatley, Frederick Douglass, Frances Harper, Anna Julia Cooper, and Sutton E. Griggs. By the dawn of the 20th century, a new tradition of intertextuality that tropes and engages with Milton in Black writing emerges. For instance, Milton can be seen reverberating as a peculiar trope in racial passing novels by Charles Chesnutt and Pauline Hopkins. James Weldon Johnson adds to this tradition with his 1916 poem, Brothers, American Drama. Oops. Yeah, okay. While the poem largely qualifies as an anti-lynching poem with closet drama tendencies, a subtext of race-mixing nuances poetic meaning that unifies the work with Chesnutt and Hopkins' novels and others by Harlem Renaissance writers Jessie Fawcett and Zora Neale Hurston. In Johnson's poem, unrhymed blank verse and satanic characterization combine to tell an unexamined story about the ways race can and does function within poetic paradigms of Miltonic intertextuality. In Johnson's poem, this Miltonic intertextuality is grounded in contextual information I shall refer to as sinful collateral. Brothers is a 7-stanza poem containing alternating dramatic monologues by a lynch mob and their soon-to-be murdered victim. From its beginning, Brothers bookmarks Johnson's innovative poem with Milton. By bookmark, I mean any of a variety of instances where a direct or elusive appropriation of some precursor literary text serves as an intertextual placeholder. Carla F.C. Holloway calls attention to the politics associated with this intertextual dynamic in Black tradition in her 2006 work, Bookmarks, Reading in Black and White. Okay, my hand is moving too fast. Okay. That work notes the important associations between texts and bodies as instructional for the stories these interactions can tell about Black folk and reading that hasn't yet made it to our library shelves. Furthermore, the books these writers mention pronounce some message about the one who carries a given book, either in public or privately. I wish to explore the interpretive salience of this dynamic as it operates commensurate with Johnson's appropriation of Milton as a poetic bookmark of Black enlightenment. Beyond alluding to Milton generically and in a unique style of poetic versification, Johnson appropriates Milton as a critical, creative subtext of sinful collateral. I wish to define two critical key terms here, critical creative and sinful collateral. And then I'll provide a brief biography of Johnson and then sort of launch into my analysis of the poem. Critical creative is a term Alec Fisher uses to emphasize the positive, imaginative aspect of critical thinking. More specifically, it constitutes a kind of evaluative thinking which involves both criticism and creative thinking, as supported by qualities of reasoning or argument. I use this term to describe the literary genius of writers like Johnson who use Milton not as decorative ornament, but strategically and masterfully as extensions of a double-voiced erudition and heritage in literary traditions. However and whenever Johnson employs Milton in Brothers, that performance may be regarded as functioning on at least two levels of genius simultaneously. Second, I use the term sinful collateral to similar ends as critical creative, wanting a theoretical description for a distinct mode of Miltonic engagement that's anchored in and worthy of Johnson's philosophical outlooks. In his autobiography, Along This Way, Johnson entertains a moment in his young adult life when he took a temporary break from college. While furloughed from college, his father made arrangements for the son to be tutored by a simple-looking cobbler of Caribbean ancestry. Despite Johnson's reservations about the abilities of this cobbler upon sight, he reports, the tutor spoke English as no professor at the university could speak it. Tutored in a room that Johnson describes as often smoky, in an atmosphere filled with the odor of smelly old shoes, the young college student read Caesar's Gallic War and Cicero's orations against Catiline. Johnson continues, my teacher did more than correct, when necessary, the way in which I translated my construed Latin sentences. He had a considerable store of collateral knowledge and gave me the benefit of it. He talked to me about Julius Caesar and Cicero, and about Roman power and Roman politics in their time. So I got more than a language out of what I read. This collateral information not only made it interesting, but gave it sense and connected up with my life. Perhaps the most common fault among teachers is the lack of collateral knowledge or the failure to make use of it. I remember that when I came to read the Greek dramatist, I was plunged directly into the text. There was no enlightenment as to how and why the plays were written or how and where they were performed. In fact, for me, they were not plays at all. They were exercises in Greek grammar. Collateral knowledge for Johnson often offers value well beyond what can be absorbed intellectually from primary sources. As the above passage illustrates, Johnson equally privileges contextual information that gives meaning in primary sources added epistemological value. In Brothers, as we soon shall see, Johnson alludes to and appropriates snippets of collateral information from Paradise Lost in particular. In one rhetorically loaded instance, an elusive appropriation from Milton's epic qualifies as sinful collateral. 5 points that I wish to share about Johnson. I presume most of us, if not all of us, know who he is, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But James Weldon Johnson was born in 1871 in Jacksonville, Florida. He died in 1938. He was an NAACP leader. He and his brothers Rosamond were composers of Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the National Negro Anthem. President Theodore Roosevelt appointed Johnson as the Consul of Venezuela and Nicaragua. Johnson held 2 professorial positions, one at New York University, another at Fisk. And he's also a writer in numerous genres. And as an author, he's known particularly for God's Trombone, a retelling of Bible stories like Milton, told in the vernacular of Black preaching style, and the racial passing novel, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. If we can turn to Johnson's anti-lynching poem at this juncture, I wish to stress that the penultimate Miltonic bookmark in Brothers literally surprises readers by sin. That's my allusion to Stanley Fish. When she is referenced by name in the middle of the literary work. Referencing her and without italicizing her name either also marks her character as an intertext of collateral knowledge. Readers cognizant of the original character Milton creates in Book 2 of the epic cannot overlook this intertextual snippet as a poetics of sinful collateral. On the other hand, if you don't know, you don't know. Moreover, you don't know that you don't know. As important sinful collateral is to the meaning of the poem on basis of form, generic affiliation, and theme, The demonic portress from Milton's epic stabilizes an intertextual ground of contention around which previous elusive indicators to the 17th century poet's presence coheres. Before sin emerges as a bookmark in Brothers, Johnson tropes with aesthetic signatures reflective of Milton's style. First, he subtitles the poem American Drama. This designation elusively bookmarks the poem as a closet drama. When considered in tandem with Johnson's subsequent and exclusive use of unrhymed blank verse throughout the poem, this designation is apt to spur a recall of Milton's final great poems, Samson Agonistes. Like that final work from Milton's oeuvre, Brothers is a dramatic poem that Johnson did not compose for the theater to be performed. That Johnson composes the entire poem in unrhymed blank verse signals a deeper intertextual affiliation with Milton's great poems. These Miltonic features combine and function as an intertextual bookmark of collateral knowledge. They at once summon a recall of the three great poems defining Milton's greatest literary triumphs, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes. Brothers appears to be the only poem by Johnson composed in unrhymed blank verse. For the most part, he writes poems in free verse. Occasionally they may rhyme, and Johnson also remains consistent with poetic convention with the several sonnets he wrote. Composed in blank verse, their rhyme schemes accord with Petrarchian and Shakespearean conventions as might be expected. These aspects of collateral knowledge should not be ignored when seeking to account for Johnson's contrary poetics of literary form in Brothers. That he deviates from these poetic practices in his only anti-lynching poem calls obvious attention to Milton's latent, yet recognizable presence of invisibility, in parentheses. His decision to eschew rhyme in a blank verse poem given to indicting racism and lynching radically reforms a style of poetics that has become a signature feature of Milton's grand and innovative style and epic tradition. Johnson racializes this poetics of form in Brothers in the interest of providing a different commentary on the suitability of unrhymed blank verse for freedom poems in the early decades of the 20th century. If we read the verse to Paradise Lost, Milton, which precedes the poem, he writes about his invention of unrhymed blank verse for epic tradition in English. The measure is English heroic verse without rhyme, as that of Homer in Greek and Virgil in Latin, rhyme being no necessary adjunct or true ornament of poem or good verse, in longer works especially, but the invention of a barbarous age to set off wretched matter and lame meter. And then at the close of the paragraph, he reads, "This neglect then of rhyme so little is to be taken for a defect, though it may seem so perhaps to vulgar readers, that it rather is to be esteemed an example set, the first in English, of ancient liberty recovered to heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming." Sandra Catherine Wilson's introduction to Johnson's complete poems offers critical insights as to why Milton's celebrated use of unrhymed blank verse may have been attractive to Johnson. According to Wilson, Johnson believed the black poet needs a form that is free and larger than dialect, but which will still hold the racial flavor, a form expressing the imagery, the idioms, the peculiar turns of thought, and which will be capable of voicing the deepest and highest emotions and aspirations. His theory aligns with the revolutionary poetics Milton defends in the verse to Paradise Lost. The first two stanzas of his poem, Johnson's poem that is, set the intertextual stage for seeing Milton's elusive and burgeoning presence throughout the poem. Here, a lynch mob conveys their thoughts about the man they soon will torture and kill. Stanza 1 opens with the mob voicing their collective hatred for their soon-to-be victim. They declare, "See, there he stands, not brave, but with an air of sullen stupor. Mark him well. Is he not more like brute than man? Look in his eye. No light is there, none save the glint that shines in the now glaring and now shifting orbs of some wild animal caught in the hunter's trap. In recognizing their adversary as a thing, a brute, they regard him as something primitively animalistic and less than human. Their racist conceptions of him in the following stanza prove even more alarming. Specifically, they wish to know, how came this beast in human shape and form? Perceiving the man before them as a hideous monstrosity amounts to regarding him as a bestial other. They subsequently command him to speak. Only then do they refer to him as a man, but only because they recognize he possesses the shape of a human being. The mob would never conceive of him as having the capacity to embody the intellectual substance of a full-fledged individual. Thus, they feel empowered to mock his racial existence and genealogical origins. For instance, they demand to know if he is not from that docile, childlike, tender-hearted race which we have known 3 centuries, not from that more than faithful race which through 3 wars fed our dear wives and nursed our helpless babes without a single breach of trust. Speak out. These lines mock the victim's racial ancestry, infantilizing him and his progenitors, in addition to reminding him that he descends from slave women whose labor sustained white Southern wives throughout the Civil War and whose breast milk nourished white babies, sometimes rather than their own. The mob's condescending rhetoric functions to rob the lynch victim of any claims to a glorious ancestral past he might otherwise proclaim. Claiming such a past, of course, would entitle him to declare himself as fully human. To these dehumanizing queries, the victim replies, I am and am not the descendant of those black mothers his tormentors wish to denigrate. Confused by this reply, they ask, then who, why are you? The victim facetiously responds. He describes his human nature using imagistic language that implies bestial subjection. I am that which lurks, he asserts, ready to spring whenever a bar is loosed. He then claims to possess the ancient trait which fights incessantly against restraint while barking at the upward climb. Then he contends he possesses the weight forever seeking to obey the law of downward pull. The imagery of caged rage, ready to pounce on one's jailer, coupled with the will to stay grounded in desolate or subterranean regions, qualify as a poetics of demonic fallenness. It is as if Johnson's protagonist victim is grounded in hell, much like Milton's devils are after the sun hurls them from the precipice of heaven. Johnson continues subscribing to a demonic poetics of fallenness the more his protagonist victim speaks. He identifies himself as the bitter fruit am I of planted seed, and then he extends the poetics of fallenness to deeper subterranean depths by explaining that his genealogical origins as a planted seed of bitter fruit constitute the resultant and inevitable end of evil forces and the powers of wrong. I'd like us to now note the chilling travails he relays in order to define himself before his white tormentors. In me, the muttered curse of dying men. On me, the stain of conquered women, and consuming me, the fearful fires of lust, lit long ago by other hands than mine. In me, the down-crushed spirit, the hurled-back prayers of wretches now long dead, their dire request. In me, the echo of the stifled cry of children for their battered mothers' breasts. Poetically cognizant of the infernal wretchedness such a genealogy makes possible, the victim can claim no race. He likewise understands no race claims him. Finally, he can do no more than relate, I am no more than human dregs, degenerate, the monstrous offspring of the monster sin. I am just what I am. The race that fed your wives and nursed your babes would do the same today, but the lynch mob cuts his narrative short, no longer wanting to hear his disturbing origin narrative, intent on completing the infernal task that gives the poem its occasion. The lynch victim's rhetorically loaded bookmark of sinful collateral in the above passage speaks Miltonic volumes. When he identifies himself as the filial progeny of sin, he invites his white tormentors to go to hell with Milton in Book 2 of Paradise Lost. Astute Miltonic readers know Johnson alludes to sin, even though her name is not italicized as often is customary when referring to her character. The victim does capitalize the character's name, therefore acknowledging sin as a proper noun. No other character in literary tradition bears this allegorical name, and no other author in literary tradition has created so fabulously or elaborated on this character as Milton has. The poetic byproduct of Milton's literary imagination, sin transcends centuries when she intertextually materializes in Johnson's poem. And we can gain a deeper appreciation of the racial poetics operating in Johnson's poem when sin's character is elaborated upon in Paradise Lost. She proceeds, and when Satan first encounters her on his way out of hell, he has no idea who she is. Thus, she must undertake the task of explaining how he once deemed her so fair in heaven. She then proceeds to chronicle how she came to be sin, contending that Satan's eyes went dim at the sight of her beauty, till on the left side, opening wide, likest to thee in shape and countenance bright, then shining heavenly fair, a goddess armed out of the head I sprung. Amazement seized all the host of heaven. Back they recoiled afraid at first, and called me sin, and for a sign portentous held me. But familiar grown I pleased, and with attractive graces won the most averse, thee chiefly, who full oft thyself in me, thy perfect image viewing, becamest enamored, and such joy thou tookest with me in secret, that my womb conceived a growing burden. Looking back on this origin narrative through 21st century sensibilities, we see Milton producing a ratchet narrative of infernal baby mama drama that Satan begets. To begin, the epic narrator states she seemed woman to the waist and fair, but ended foul in many a scaly fold, voluminous and vast, a serpent armed with mortal sting. Readers also learn about her middle round, a cry of hellhounds never ceasing barked, with wide Cerberian mouths full loud and rung a hideous peal. Yet when they list would creep, if aught disturbed their noise into her womb and kennel there, yet there still barked and howled within unseen, far less abhorred than these, vexed Scylla, bathing in the sea that parts Calabria from the hoarse Trinicarian shore. Nor uglier follow the night hag when, called in secret, riding through the air she comes, lured with the smell of infant blood, to dance with Lapland witches, while the laboring moon eclipses at their charms. We see this baby mama drama continuing to play out as we learn that death even impregnates his mother, so that Satan's son, grandson, daughter, it's this nasty incestuous mix. Sin's graphic portraiture not only qualifies as a poetic instance of early modern ratchetness, its motif of infernal baby mama drama holds interpretive salience for Johnson's stinging indictment of lynch culture and U.S. racism in the 20th century poem. First, where the Miltonic character Death is concerned, his monstrous shape and form function as interpretive sinful collateral as well. It primes Johnson's audience to recognize the lynch victim as ancestrally and intertextually connected. When the lynch mob earlier asserts that they acknowledge the victim as a man only because he wears his shape, that backhanded compliment echoes Death's hideous deformity as described by Milton's epic narrator. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substances might be called that shadow seemed, for each seemed either. Black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head, the likeness of a kingly crown, had on. Here, Satan's monstrous son may be read as racialized and bearing a black complexion. If he and sin, by extension, appear fiercer than 10 furies and possess a frightening spirit of hellish terror, their racialized descriptions run consistent with the denigrating stereotypes that often branded Africanist peoples throughout the early modern period as fiendish devils. These demonic signifiers constitute a few examples, I'm not going to work with it, constitute a few examples of the topological things of darkness Kim Hall theorizes about in her study on the economies of race that provide a distinct cartographic meeting ground where key routes for the ancient trade in black slaves and gold can be traced in the English language and its flourishing literature as well. Toni Morrison's comments about British Africanisms in Playing in the Dark and the White Imagination prove instructive here as well. Hall and Morrison's work provide scholars like us theoretical tools to pin down ways of reading racial matters and their operations through a more contemporary poetics of critical creative reflection. Poet critics of Johnson's caliber see and take note of the issues imbricated in the things of darkness that Milton and other pre-1800 writers have handed down to us from previous centuries. Rather than seeing race through a glass darkly, they write with insightful clarity about the various ways Africanist presence in pre-1800 writings can be teased out of elusive hiding. Johnson's anti-lynching poem illustrates the working of this clever practice with race as an intertext in Milton's writings. His appropriation of sin and the satanic infamy associated with her character qualifies as a telling property of sinful collateral. What I'd like us to see when reading, studying, or teaching Brothers is that the victim protagonist's self-identification as a filial descendant of the monster sin is no trivial matter. Surprising us by sin actually troubles a poetics of hegemonic whiteness that Johnson sees operating in Paradise Lost. For centuries, Anglo-American literary tradition has defined whiteness as epitomizing standards of purity, chasteness, and all that may be thought of as heavenly. Many a literary aesthete has substantiated this hegemonic outlook by contributing to whitewashing the English language so that it might align poetically with these norms of seeing, reading, interpreting, and knowing the world. Johnson irreligiously challenges these assumptive word workings of racial whiteness by employing a poetics of sinful collateral that turns this epistemological formation inside out and upside down against itself. The moment of telling subversion occurs when the poem's lynch victim utterly confounds the tyrannical mob who burn him alive. After maiming and killing him, the mob or infernal crew feels justified, having avenged what they regard as the victim's fiendish crime. Preparing to return home to their respective wives and children, they announce their confusion concerning their dead victim's final words. What did he mean, they ask, when in his last muttered words he cried, "Brothers in spirit, and brothers indeed are we." While the victim's stinging rebuke goes above the heads of the lynch mob, his meaning does not confound those of us who understand the intertextual benefits of Johnson's appropriation of Paradise Lost. Conscious to his dying breath that black women, wives, and mothers, in so many instances, nurtured the white race from cradle to the grave, the lynch victim recognizes he and his tormentors indeed are of one blood. This being true, the lynch victim is no more a devil than his white assailants. Our lynch victim dies in the faith of this belief, enjoying Paradise Lost as a signifying text of sinful collateral that ingeniously empowers him to have the last laugh on his tormentors unto death, while giving us a rich poetics of intertextuality to examine, analyze, and engage that most pernicious of strange fruits, hate.
Thank you for this fantastic talk. I have a question for you.
Okay.
I'm not as familiar with sort of Weldon Johnson's history of reading, but I was wondering if he encountered like 19th century African-American newspapers. So I'm like thinking of the North Star, the Christian Recorder, the Chicago Defender, when they sort of went national in like the 1850s, where there are, it seems like almost every single edition, there's Milton and Shakespeare, and there's arguments about who is better. And it seems to me that Milton becomes this sort of like metonym for how you think about sin, how you do all these things. So I'm wondering if the way that you read is that you're already sort of receiving a history of Black Americans who sort of spent their time every week with the newspaper engaging with these early modern playwrights, to the point where it just becomes a part of Weldon Johnson's vernacular, that you can see that like other people who work on 19th century are like, I didn't even realize that people were thinking about Milton and Shakespeare from like the first newspaper, the North Star, in 1847, all the way through. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, yes. So I can't claim to speak about Johnson. I really need to get into the papers and really see those aspects, but it makes sense to me that by this time, certainly Milton is in the culture of African-American newspapers. Pauline Hopkins, 2 of her serialized novels actually quote and appropriate passages from Paradise Lost, right? And so I think it's just generally in the culture, right, and easily accessible. And what I enjoy about this work is it's just that one word, sin, right? So to be surprised by sin in a very different way by that character. If you don't know sin, it's just this little snippet, and I think that really speaks to the critical creative genius of Black writers. It's so much in their vernacular, it's so much in them, that they don't need an extended passage. They can simply signify on a character, or they can signify on a verse form. They can signify on closet drama within unrhymed blank verse. And if you don't know that you don't know, then who doesn't know, right? And I think so it's a very racialized type of appropriation and intertextuality. Oh.
That was so fantastic. And I want to follow on the signifying of closet drama, because one of the things that I was thinking about from the beginning of you talking is Milton planned Paradise Lost as a 5-act play. So, you know, and I think there's something, I mean, okay, because I love theater, but I think there's something, I don't know, liminal about that space of closet drama, that space of even conceiving of something as a play. Because one of the things I've always thought is that one of the things that happens with Milton's characters is they get away from him. Like, they do things that actually are not things he would allow them to do. And one of my favorite moments, I think about what Jericho Brown said last night, one of my favorite moments is when Eve is looking in the pond and the line is, herself preferred. And I think, yes, and leave it at that, honey. Like, she and Sen should have run off together and we're done, you know what I'm saying? But in the context of what you're talking about, that's really powerful for me also. First of all, I love the term critico-creative. It's a really, to me it's really rich. But the second thing is that I think also this sense of, I don't know, of sinful collaboration, of rethinking a kind of outside representation, inside representation that's going on with that, and the theatricality of it. So this is not a question as much as it is like, yum. Thank you.
Yum. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you. So I minored in African American literature in college, and your talk made me think about the ways that our colleagues in African American literature have ignored this intertextuality, and I wondered if you wanted to riff on the potential politics of that, or why you think that how that developed and why it persists.
the overlooking, the dissing, the dismissing. Ooh, I love that. The dismissing. That's the paper. I think there's such a convoluted politics around our beingness in literature as literary scholars, certain periodizations where we feel unseen. I remember my seminar paper with Gregory Semenza, which is where all of this really came up. I'm reading books 1 and 2. I could not help but think, with all of this enslavement imagery, if black readers are reading this, how could they not be inspired, empowered by Satan? That was my initial instinctive cultural reading. Jericho was talking about that last night. But also the white gaze, I've been talking about Toni Morrison a lot, the white gaze, the fear of that white gaze sitting on the shoulder. To me, I was saying, that's ridiculous. He's gonna shun it. He's gonna say that's ridiculous. And so I set up a meeting with him, tell him, hey, I have this idea, this is what I think I'm gonna do my seminar paper. And to my surprise, he encouraged it. But I think that the fear of the gaze, that white gaze, that haunts us when we read these sacred white texts, in these sacred white traditions, in sacred PWIs, right? And then if we're talking about the crossover into HBCUs, that there's a different type of politics around why do I have to read Milton? I remember as an undergraduate, I know the Bible, I know the Genesis story. Why do I need to read Paradise Lost, right? Totally missed it, right? But I had black religion and that was enough for me, right? And yet we come into these English classes, I can imagine at an HBCU having to, I want to read Frederick Douglass, I don't want to read Milton, he has nothing to say to me, right? And so I think that all of those politics are always there, and so how do we come to a sense of, I was talking with someone about this yesterday, coining August Wilson's phrase, standing on our own self-defining ground, so that we can get that white gaze off, so we can do the work that culture is calling us to do. But I don't think that we have teased that out collectively. I think we do it individually. Some of us fail by trying, or we spend a lifetime trying to get there, which is why I think spaces like this are so validating. And then what do we do with it beyond this moment becomes salient. Where do we go? And when we speak and when we teach, I think it's just this continual work of having to get the white gaze off of us, even in our scholarship and even in our teaching, and giving ourselves the license and permission and the agency to do this work that has just been ignored, right? I mean, I think there's this argument, I think that's what was fascinating to me about this poem, that it's just sin. Well, it really is more than sin. It's the unrhymed blank verse, but it's the sin and how you would just sort of bypass that. In Fawcett's Plum Bun, Lycidas is mentioned. And you just treat it, Angela's just reading it as a homework assignment. Until you look deeper into the poem, there's nothing but nautical imagery that's playing out, right? And so I think we have to train ourselves to trust ourselves, right? To trust that racial reading. And certainly we want to be critiqued, but to not be scared of the cultures that nurtured us into our intelligence, because we are always organic intellectuals and traditional ones simultaneously.
Thank you. Brilliant. I really appreciate that you were using Johnson. And as you were quoting this, where you said that his origin story was being interrupted, I really love that, because it made me think about the autobiography of the ex-colored man, and how Johnson is also creating a fictional origin story. Yes. And I love that he initially published it anonymously, so people were fraught with this anxiety that there are actually African American people running around as passing as white people. Yes. And so there was this anxiety about, like, who is this real? Is this somebody's real story? And eventually he published it under his name. Yes. And
you know, the anxiety probably was diffused and all of that. So I'm thinking about this connection to this origin story with Milton, and there's this, he goes back to Paradise Lost. So is this almost like another fictional attempt to kind of create an origin story that is somehow also complicated in the way that Johnson complicates origin story? I don't know if this makes any sense, but to me this was just fascinating about this replication of the origin story.
And so repeat the question part of it.
Do you think that's also a dynamic that you see with Milton in this maybe abbreviated or reformed kind of origin story that we're getting, that he's using Paradise Lost to do this kind of work that Johnson is doing?
Yes. So I think one of the things that fascinates me about Milton is, who is this man that dares to believe he can rewrite every genre given to him, change it, succeed, and live on in perpetuity as the Sugar Honey Iced Tea? It's my acronym. Who could dare have that type of swagger and then pull it off? And how do you emerge in the shadows of Shakespeare, right, within 3 or 4 decades of his death? Like, how do you who does that? How do you take this English language that decades prior to his birth was considered the Ebonics of its day? No self-respecting person would dare speak English. And then he gives us Paradise Lost, showing us the dexterity and the elasticity of the language. Who could do that but him and flex, right? So I think that is an origin story, right? How do you emerge out of the shadows of that and become this famous writer well beyond your death? I think that is a different type of origin story. And then to ground it in the origin story of Genesis, at a moment where English nationhood is in flux, right, on the brink of disaster. And he's very clear that he is writing for his nation's namesake, right? So there's so many origin narratives going on in Milton's writing. It's personal, it's cultural, it's nationalist, and just trying to carve out a space. You know, he's like an OG gangster, an MC gangster, hip-hop gangster, right? So yeah, I think all of that is going on. And so maybe that too is attractive to black writers or othered writers who need to make space for themselves, stand tall, look folk in the eyes. I'm preaching my mama now. Look folk in, you are somebody, right? And to do that with Milton. Now you can do that with Shakespeare and get a particular type of purchase, but when you do that with Milton, people got to really take you at a different level.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it, actually, because we're at time. So can we get another round of applause for Reginald Wilburn?
Thank you.